So we're moving on, dear friends, and let me remind you that there are questions can be asked freely. You're very welcome to ask questions. I would urge you even to ask questions. All that you need to do is to scan the QR code that you can see in the bottom of the screen right now. Scan the QR code and ask questions on the platform that you will see as a result of this QR code. It's going to be a pleasure for us to answer your questions as long as we have time. But right now, we have Alexander Nesterov. He is a leading data scientist at Sberbank. Good afternoon, dear friends. Today I will tell you about medical text analysis technology that we are developing in AI lab at Sber. In the recent decades, there have been an increase in the amount of medical records saved electronically. And the majority of these medical data are text data, some text records. These are medical texts that are recorded into electronic health records. Unfortunately, I don't have exact statistics about how many electronic health records are saved. However, this amount can be indirectly assessed by the number of publications on the subject. According to electronic health records, in pubmed.gov, on this search, you can see there is a many-fold increase in publications on the subject of electronic health records. Electronic health records in the volumes that have been accumulated already, there's a huge volume. They help sort out a lot of practical tasks. For instance, using this data, we can build systems to support doctors with making decisions to estimate lethality in different diseases, to discover some side effects of different medications and drugs, to phenotype patients, to select patients for participation in different clinical trials or epidemiological trials, for creation medical knowledge databases, for personalized medicine. So for everything that we call personalized approach for treatment of patients and many other things. As you can see, there is a huge volume of medical data, and in combination with a lot of tasks that can be resolved with their help, make intellectual analysis of medical text very relevant. Analysis of electronic health records is quite a complex task in terms of natural language processing. Why is that? The reason is that electronic health records usually consist of dynamic combination of structured or semi-structured and non-structured at all text. Non-structured text, what belongs here? Patient complaints, their anamnesis, their medical history and their diseases, their diagnosis. Semi-structured text, what falls into this category? Instrumental results or different test results or lab results. Structured tasks. For instance, tables from the labs, results of tests, different codes of medicines and dosage of medicines. Also, medical texts have a number of linguistic features that make it more difficult to process them. For instance, the richness of specific terminology, complex and volatile structure of sentences, a lot of typos, misprints, missing some terms or words or punctuation, a lot of abbreviations, a lot of symbols. Also, context-dependent terms, meaning terms the meaning of which really depends on the context that they're applied in. A lot of synonyms of different terms. And also, medical terms often consist of many words that are also scattered throughout different parts of the text. From technical standpoint, medical text analysis task can be split into subtasks, such as text classification, recognition of named entities, extraction of different relations, and others. Subtasks of classification includes phenotyping, coding with the help of ICD codes, prediction of symptom severity, prediction of different complications, or prediction of lethality or mortality, so on and so forth. What falls into the category of named entities recognition is a clinical concept extraction, de-identification, detection of negotiation or other attributes of terms. Another subgroup, treatment and relations, here what falls into this category.
It's also about treatment of time relations, clinical relations, and relations between side effects of drugs and the drugs themselves. They also highlight text for information search, summing, generation of conclusions automatically, machine interpretation and translation of medical texts, acronym understanding, and many other similar tasks. As you may observe, on the one hand, analytics of medical texts is very important and essential. On the other hand, it's pretty complex, and certain small groups of researchers, small hospitals will not be able to do this with a high quality. And in order to help solve this essential task, they create frameworks that include a ton of algorithms to analyze medical texts. For example, a product here is the one made by Apache. That's together with Mayo Clinic developed a framework for Apache CTRX that allows to structure unstructured medical texts. As you may see here, there are a lot of entities here of different sorts. There are relations between those entities, etc. This framework overall is widely used in the Western context. Also, it is possible to represent a very new framework from Amazon. Amazon Comprehend Medical. It helps to structure medical texts, clean them, and do more detailed analytics in terms of clinical research. Governmental institutions are not falling behind either. That includes the development by the CDC in the US, the Clinical Language Engineering Workbench, which includes a number of modules that analyzes each a particular set of information, type of information, structured, unstructured, putting them together into one unified service. At the moment, this framework is being tested on cancer research data, and in the future, they're going to expand it for the entire range of medical data. As you may have noticed, for the English language, there is a wide range of decent solutions. As for Russian language, unfortunately, up till now, we didn't have those. And our lab of AI in Sber has set an objective to create a framework that would help to analyze medical texts in Russian. And at the moment, it includes the following modules. The module for treatment of different sort of medical concepts and normalization of those concepts. The module for filtering non-medical text. The module that helps to recommend symptoms that need to be clarified, talking to the patient, client, or user. The module that helps to generate questions in a natural language, those questions that must be asked to the patient. And last but not least is the module that helps to predict possible diseases for a patient. Let me tell you in a bit more detail about the technologies that are in the basis of our system. Of course, the most important thing is a large-scale language model based on BERT architecture. We have taught this model in a lab using the large set of medical texts. These are open medical texts, mostly research publications, maybe some study books, and this sort of pre-training helped us to put into this model some medical knowledge that in turn allows us to improve the quality of the solution of our practical tasks. Next module is module for treatment and normalization of medical concepts. What is a medical concept here? This is a term or a disease or a symptom or for example, some sort of drug, etc. Naturally, this sort of sub-entities are not only meant for some abstract piece of text. That also would include a medical concept for unified medical language, international vocabulary of medical terms. This module consists of two parts. First part is neural network model based on BERT architecture, represented in the previous slide. It classifies medical text based on the presence of certain medical entities in a particular place. Second module is module for information search and retrieval, which again, based on the vocabulary of medical terms, searches for those terms in the text and shows what is that entity, what is that concept, and where it is. Therefore, having extracted this medical concept out of a medical text, we structure that data set. We create a structured data set, and we can have extracted entities for phenotyping of patients and selecting them to participate in clinical trials. For example, we need smokers who have heart disease. So, when we're looking at the history of disease, the fact, for example, that the person has heart disease or that the person is a smoker allows us to automatically invite the patients for a clinical study. Also, the entities that we have extracted can serve as a basis to build a more specialized model of AI. Next model is the one that classifies initial medical text depending on whether it has medical context. For example, you see two types of text. If you don't take a closer look, they are similar. One of them is medical, another one is about my soul is aching, or my tail and paws are aching and falling off. Left texts are actually about headache and dizziness. The texts on the right are metaphorical. They seem to be medical, but they are metaphorical. That's been a joke. So the model should not be working with this sort of text. It's a reason for error. That's why we have this module that filters medical texts versus non-medical texts. Next model is Health Profiler, a very serious model based on BERT architecture that allows, based on complaints, anamnesis, lab analysis, instrumental research, age, sex of the patient, set the preliminary diagnosis. I mean, legally, we cannot do diagnostics online, but we can predict them so that the doctor sees that in advance. Or Based on the initial predicted diagnosis, it is possible to assume which doctor should treat this patient. I mean, there's no diagnosis per se, but we can direct a patient based on a state to a particular doctor, based on this predicted diagnosis. We can even see a typo, so the model can work with any sort of text complexity. It's been trained well. Next, module to clarify symptoms. Why do we need it? For example, you have a patient approaching you, and the patient says that he has sore throat and cough, or temperature. But we would like to ask whether the patient has strong cough, dry cough, inflammation, red skin, or something like that. For that, we need a module that would assume additional auxiliary symptoms that might this patient have. So what sort of questions we need to ask patient to set the diagnosis more clearly? And this module of ours can do it. Initially, it predicts other potential symptoms that the patient may have. Next, it generates a question on a natural language. That question we ask to a user. As you may have understood, this module can be used in different sorts of dialogue agents, chatbots. And now, let us try and solve based on combining the capabilities of different modules of our system. So, let's take cyberchondria. Cyberchondriac disorder, when a person is looking for complaints based on so-called quote-unquote Dr. Google. So it's a diagnosis made by Dr. Google. Okay. Probably we have all been visiting Dr. Google from time to time, and as research shows, up to 70% of users search for their symptoms online instead of going to a doctor. So they first Google their symptoms, then they go to a doctor. So how can we help those patients? So that they're not going to Dr. Google, but they're actually applying to a more qualified system and a more qualified doctor that will definitely help them and point them to a correct type of doctors. So let us make a medical assistant. What does it have to be able to do? First, we need to understand what sort of text has been delivered from a doctor, from a patient. I mean, is it a joke? Or is it a real text? For that, it's good to use module with the textual classification based on medical context. All right, we have defined that indeed the module, the text sent by user is true. It contains medical context. Now, we need to ask, what other complaints does the patient have? What else is troubling the patient? That will help us to make a more precise recommendation. And the symptoms inquiring module is in charge of that. So next, based on the information that we have collected, based on what the user told us initially, based on what answers it gave, we will be able to point a patient to a particular doctor. For that, we have the health profile module that, based on the text from the user, will be able to assume diagnosis. And based on a possible diagnosis, will be able to point a patient to a particular doctor. As you may see, when we combine different modules from the system, we create quite a coherent system that solves practical tasks. These modules can be combined differently. We can use them separately or together in different combinations, depending on what sort of task you want to solve. Overall, that helps us to analyze and process medical texts and solve a number of, let me reiterate, practical tasks. Thank you for your attention, and we have a few more minutes, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Yeah, Alexander, thank you so much for your presentation. There's a range of questions that we wanted to ask. And don't hesitate, by the way, to use QR codes at the bottom of the screen to ask your questions. So, questions to Alexander right now. So, brief question. What sort of metrics have you been using? For different tasks, we use different metrics. For classification of text, we have been using classification-based metrics, accuracy, FNarrow. For generation of text, we have been using, therefore, metrics, rouge, blue. That depends on the task. Thank you. Question from the audience. What diagnoses are possible to be set based on this technology? Well, we have 1,500 diagnoses, and there I will not list all of them, but the most frequent ones that we encounter. What's the most popular? Of course, the flu. The flu. Well, I mean, you may use it for that. So at the moment, we have medical solutions developed on the basis of AR, VR, big data, etc., and other digital solutions. There is for diagnostics at the moment. What is the difference of your technology compared to other solutions? Well, the major difference is that it works in Russian as well. Yes, there are certain solutions that also do work with the Russian language. However, they work with structured texts. I've seen those solutions from a range of companies. They analyze your analysis, research analysis, images, X-ray shots, medical images, but they cannot work with non-structured medical texts. I have not even seen research publications dedicated to that. Those publications that suggest how to structure unstructured medical texts. So we are the first to actually do that, and it's quite a breakthrough for Russian language. In addition to that, we have developed a special model, medical model, a large medical model called Bertha. We have taught it, we have trained it, it's yet closed. Later, we will probably share it to the community, depending on the will of the top management. But the fact is that there are no similar models for the Russian language whatsoever. Something that will allow it to solve a more complex practical task. Awesome, thank you. Another question. This module, how can it predict symptoms and diagnosis? What data is used for training? Maybe it's self-training. How can we predict symptoms? Well, this is quite an interesting subject. I mean, naturally, the module of recommendations of systems, it does not simply predict what symptoms to ask about. It needs to predict the symptoms that, first and foremost, probably the patient will have. And also, it needs to increase the probability of correct diagnostics. So the model is self-trained, either based on the symptoms that the patient has already, or based on the text. So the same range of symptoms represented as text. And it can predict symptoms from a predefined list. Again, based on 5,000 most highly frequent symptoms. And then the symptoms are estimated by a model based on diagnostics. And overall, we can be sure with high probability that the symptoms, that some additional symptoms will be there. As for predicting diagnosis, this is the model that, based on text, I mean, the symptom is delivered in text, and the results of lab analysis are also in text, demographics, etc. So based on text, it can predict possible diagnosis. Both models are trained in supervised mode, and so there is corresponding data set with mapping, so which diagnosis corresponds to which text, and for example, which initial symptoms correspond to additional symptoms. So please welcome once more Alexander Nesterov with the workshop on the technologies to analyze medical texts in Sberbank, and we continue.